Guys, sometimes I just don't understand how we got here. I was looking at something today that absolutely blew my mind. It's probably something you may have heard of before, but as I ran across this, I didn't remember ever seeing this before, or maybe realizing what I had seen when I saw it. But what I'm going to talk about in this video is St. Peter's Basilica. It's an amazing architectural structure for sure. It stands in the square of the Vatican. Inside and out, it is a feat of architecture. Many sculptures and reliefs, different words in Latin written in different places around the structure. For instance, inside the dome itself, there's a Latin engraving that says this: "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." And that's a quote out of Matthew 16 and the Vulgate. But as I dug deeper into learning about St. Peter's Basilica, now I was studying something totally different. But I dug into what is St. Peter's Basilica? Where was it built? When was it built? I started looking at all of these things. And when you go right to Wikipedia's page, it says, "The Papal Basilica of St. Peter in the Vatican, or simply St. Peter's Basilica, is a church built in the Renaissance style located in the Vatican City, the papal enclave that is within the city of Rome, Italy. Initially planned by Pope Nicholas V and Pope Julius II to replace the aging old St. Peter's Basilica, which was built earlier by Constantine the Great. Construction of St. Peter's Basilica began on April 18th of 1506 and was completed on November 18th of 1626. Well, that's amazing right there. It took over 100 years to build. Seems strange. But I saw this and I had read just these words about the basilica itself, the current St. Peter's Basilica. And when I saw that statement that it was built to replace the aging old St. Peter's Basilica, well, I had to see what was the old St. Peter's Basilica. What was it all about? So I just clicked into the Wikipedia page on Old St. Peter's Basilica. It says Old St. Peter's Basilica was the building that stood from the 4th to the 16th centuries. Apparently, the new one has only stood for 400 years, but this old one stood for 1,200 years, from the 4th to the 16th century, where the new St. Peter's Basilica stands today in Vatican City. The construction of the basilica built over a historical site during the reign of Emperor Constantine I. Constantine, of course, is the Roman emperor that held the Council of Nicaea in the 300s AD. And so, again, I had gone one level deeper, and I said to myself, wow, old St. Peter's Basilica. So the new one was built on top of the old one, or in place of the old one. And then the old one here, as we just read, says it was built over another historical site. What was that historical site? Well, the historical site that old St. Peter's Basilica was built on top of was the site of the Circus of Nero. That's right, the Circus of Nero, the place where, just like in the gladiator arenas and the Colosseums of later Rome, this is where the persecution of Christianity started. Christians in the Circus of Nero were dragged behind chariots. They were drawn and quartered. They were tied between two draft horses and stretched until they ripped apart. They were eaten alive by all manner of wild beasts from different parts of the world: lions, leopards, tigers, bears. It was the sport of the circus for Nero and his consort to see what new way of killing a Christian they could come up with. And why do you think that Nero was killing the Christians in his circus? Well, that had to do with the Great Fire of Rome in July of 64 AD in the first century. It is well known that during the Fire of Rome, 2/3 of Rome was burned to the ground. But what you may not have heard or known was when we read in Tacitus's writings, he was a historian from later Rome. He wrote about this time period. He said that it was well known throughout the kingdom and that the emperor himself was unable to hide the fact that he had actually had the fires of Rome started, and that he couldn't drown out the talking of people that said it was probably started by him. But, of course, he blamed it on the Christians, and he brought them into the circus in punishment for the Great Fire, even though it was his own doing. Hundreds of Christians were tortured, brutalized, and murdered in Nero's circus. Interestingly enough, also, the Circus of Nero was known as not only the place of the martyrdoms of many Christians in the first century, but also the place of the martyrdom of Peter himself and Paul, the apostles. So think about the significance of Peter in the Catholic Church. Of course, this whole conversation started around St. Peter's Basilica, right? It came to me as I was reading this that this is not a place, a location of honor for Peter, but a place of misery, torture, and death for not only him, but all the Christians in the first century under Nero. And if you know much about the traditional understanding of how Peter died, it's said in many writings of early Christians that he died being crucified upside down on an upside down cross. I don't know what that makes you think of, but when I think of an upside down cross, I think of witchcraft. I think of Satanism. It is the ultimate affront to Christ to put forth an upside down cross. But what's interesting is that the Catholic Church built St. Peter's Basilica on top of Old St. Peter's, which was built on top of the place of shame and torture and murder of Christians, including Peter, who was crucified on an upside-down cross. And it doesn't stop there. If we now come back out of the rabbit hole and think about what's in the Vatican, what's going on in the Catholic Church, the upside-down cross starts to make a little more sense. This is a picture of what is called the tomb of St. Peter inside the Vatican. Notice that it's black. The Vatican is filled with all sorts of imagery that is dark, it's evil, and it's serpentine. The papal audience hall itself is structured after the head of a venomous snake. Many of the crosiers of the bishops in the Catholic Church are headed with entwined snakes. There's a staircase in the middle of the Vatican that is built in a spiral, just like a coiled snake. The stage in the papal audience hall is set up like a cadre of demons behind the Pope himself. Is the Pope meant to look like the leader of a demon horde? The number of strange and odd sculptures that are kept at the Vatican in public sight is too many to count. For a place that pronounces itself to be the center of God's work on earth, this makes no sense whatsoever. And it certainly makes no sense, or maybe now it starts to make sense, why they would build St. Peter's Basilica on top of a place where hundreds upon hundreds of the earliest Christians, our forefathers as Christians, were killed, maimed, tortured to death. When are we going to wake up and start realizing the evil that's been perpetrated upon us for centuries? And honestly, this makes me start to wonder, based on the dating of the basilica, the new basilica and the old basilica, and the time period there, the old basilica supposedly being standing untouched for 1,200 years and without being rebuilt. Doesn't it start to make you wonder about the timeline involved? 1,200 years for old St. Peter's Basilica to stand sounds like a lot. And knowing that most of the people who think our chronologies and timelines are incorrect and falsified, many of them believe the Catholic Church is largely responsible for that falsification. And then the Circus of Nero being the foundation of the main chapel hall of the Vatican, St. Peter's Basilica. Could it get any more ridiculous than that? Does this help you understand the inscription inside the dome of St. Peter's Basilica a little better? It says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Well, yes, they built their church literally on the bones of the martyrs, including Peter and Paul. And I believe they did it to desecrate the name of Jesus Christ in the world. The foundation of St. Peter's Basilica was laid on the bones of the Christian martyrs. And they pretend like that is honoring to Christ? In the name of Christ, I declare the Catholic Church my enemy, and I will do everything I can to expose it. How has humanity been duped into thinking this was honorable and true and good? When are we as Christians, the true Christians in the world, going to call these people out for their evil? When are we going to call out the Pope and the Vatican and the Catholic Church for corrupting the name of Christ in the world, for corrupting the church, for corrupting the vision of God among man? May God have mercy on the souls of those who built and perpetuated the Catholic Church.